Good afternoon and Happy New Year's. Thank you for joining me. We're about to begin a webinar focusing on interim journey, uh, but I want to welcome those of you who are arriving and give a few moments to allow those who might want to arrive. Um, I also wanted to acknowledge that there is a place where you can offer comments during this webinar, ask questions, make observations. You can also introduce yourself, and I'm going to offer to the group as we get to the end an opportunity to receive the introduction and overview to the interim journey resource that I'll be describing. Um, and so please feel free to use the comment section. Since I'm relatively new at this whole Facebook Live webinar technology, I'm learning to find and respond to that as well. So I'm going to pause from time to time, and we'll do that to see if there are notes you're leaving me or if there is uh, something I can respond to. And I think the more that what I'm sharing is responsive to what you're thinking or asking or needing, the better this whole webinar gets. And so that's part of my strategy. That in this technology, I can't see you right away, and like Zoom, but it also has other features that can be very helpful. So welcome, and we'll begin formally in just a little bit. Again, as you arrive, please uh, find the comments section, and maybe introduce yourself so that others on board will know your name too. And if you leave your, if you're unfamiliar to me, leave your contact information. I'll be happy to send you a copy of the introduction and overview of this resource that I'll be introducing you to in just a few, beginning in just a few minutes. But welcome. So the heart of this webinar is to introduce you to a resource called Interim Journey, which literally tries to literally provides support to Christian life, to congregations and Christian communities as they look to navigate through an interim time. Now, I kind of want to set the table for introducing you to this resource. I find the word interim stimulating. I'm wondering what comes through your mind as soon as you hear it. Um, One quick response might be, well, interim is when one pastor leaves and we're waiting for the next one. But it can be much more than that. Think about it with me for a bit. The definition that first comes to my mind is interim is a time in between times. Something's changing. I don't know what your reaction to that is, but as soon as you hear time in between times or change, is that good or is that bad? Or maybe it just depends. Or maybe you've got stories that would go both ways. In the Old Testament, time in between times were often very yeasty times, times when formation and growth and change renewed hearts and minds as God called his people. Uh, it's interesting for us as we consider supporting an interim journey in 2021. This is an unprecedented time for our world, but for our churches and for any organization that's involved in interim. Let me suggest for a moment, we've been living in the midst of a pandemic. It's global. So literally there's no part of our world that hasn't been touched deeply by that. We've lost things. We haven't lost everything. But there's so many unknowns. What are we learning? What will the other side of this time in between look like? How can we plan for it? How can we get ready for it? How can we engage it, anticipate it, say yes to it? That's a complex issue. Now let's add the fact that maybe your church is changing pastors. The pastor may have already left, or the pastor may have announced that you're going to, they will be leaving. And so that whole upheaval that begins to happen when a congregation, especially if they've been engaged with a pastor that's loved and has been present with them for a good long time, a lot of things were very predictable and very stable and very um, refreshing. Uh, and now, what's next? A time in between times. Yeasty. You know, it's interesting that the Center for Parish Development, which now is in its 53rd year, um, was founded back in 1968 precisely to help Christian communities begin to navigate the radical changes that were happening all around us. Um, Changes in our context, changes within our ministry, whole new fields of knowledge. Uh, it's with that background and that research that I'll be introducing you to the resources that are involved in the interim journey process. Um, my name is Ray Schulte. I guess I forgot to even introduce myself to you. This is my 31st year on the staff of the Center for Parish Development, and I'm now the executive director. It's a very privileged place to be, privileged to be able to link arms, hearts, and efforts in supporting Christian life across denominations, small churches, large churches. I'm privileged to have you join me today. Um, this webinar will be available on this Facebook page for weeks after this for those who might find it valuable and were unable to be here during this specific time that we're in today. So interim time. What is it like to be in an interim time, in a time in between times? Well, there's a whole field of knowledge called change management and systems that describes it rather aptly, and I'll share with you some of the characteristics, but I'm suspecting they will ring very true to you. Let me offer you a metaphor. This is adapted and embraced by the Center for Parish Development and some of our resources from the early on when I joined the staff in the 1990s. We use the metaphor of the Exodus experience in the Bible to talk about the kinds of changes that churches were going through. Moving from Egypt and then the journey to the promised land. But the graphic that we created, and I can't show you that in this format, although if you're really interested, let me know and I'll make it available to you. The graphic talked about Egypt as the current situation, the now, and some of the past that frame and help us understand the now. And then obviously the promised land is the future that we're beginning to try and envision and hope for. And everyone in every organization, when they're moving into the transformation zone, wants to jump from Egypt to heaven. I mean, to the faithful future, and the richness of the research about it is that the only way that one gets from Egypt to the promised land is by going through the desert in the middle. And so we literally labeled the parts of the chart A, C, B. And everyone would always ask, why isn't that A, B, C? And the answer was because the only way you get from A to B is through C, a time in between times. Well, that's what we're talking about in helping churches navigate the interim process of changing their pastor, but also churches that are in the midst of an interim time trying to deal with and respond and emerge on the other side of a major pandemic. So what's at stake here? How important is this? Is the difference to make an operational change or a strategic change? Or is some of the classic management science talks about, uses different language, is it a technical change or an adaptive change? Adaptive or strategic change meaning whole new ways of thinking and understanding, not just tweaking some operational details. Sometimes churches approach changing pastors as, well, our pastor's leaving, this is just a change of staff, let's get somebody in here that we think we like as quick as we can. And yet the implications of that change, what kind of criteria do we use, and what's at stake in calling a pastor to come and join this congregation, a congregation that is called by God to participate in God's mission and ministry in this time and in this place. I can remember working with a church where it wasn't the senior pastor was leaving, it was just an associate pastor who was very beloved and had been there a good while, but who was leaving, and they wanted to replace them. But far from being an operational decision, they felt that they needed to reconsider the whole way in which the place in which the church existed, its ministry context was changing, and how were we being called to be responsive to it and aware of it in brand new ways. What are the real resources in our community, but also the needs? What are the real resources within our church and our membership, our current membership, and how it's changed? Is even the staffing model that we've thought of and used in the past relevant for the future that we're called to? If the heart of our calling, the ultimate criteria for how we would choose a leader, has everything to do with God and what God's calling us to be and do now. All right. Now I've set the table for the richness and the importance of what an interim journey seeks to support a congregation in moving through. Let me stop here for a moment. I'm looking to see if there's any comments from anyone, questions or observations or reactions to what I've shared so far. I'm going to move on shortly, but I want to welcome those at any time. I'm going to move to introducing you to the resources that we call Interim Journey. There are 5 steps or components to it. What I want to do is really introduce you to the what and the why of each resource, and then a little bit of the how. But I think clear about what each of these components are and why they're important and supportive of an interim journey will be very important and helpful for you in appreciating the power of this set of resources and the difference that they can make in the life of a Christian church. After each of these, I'll share, tell a little story, and then I'll pause again to look to see if there are comments or questions that you might have. Just make sure that I'm queued up over here. Now I'm seeing. So welcome, Eric, Daniel. Appreciate you introducing yourself. All right. So let me introduce you to 5 key resources, the what and the why, and a little bit of the how, that literally helps a congregation to generate a missional profile and enter into a missional process. What I think we're ultimately after is, how do we help ourselves to connect anew with one another and with God as we move through an interim time? And so you'll see as I point out each of these 5 steps or 5 components of this resource, there's broad concern for not only the content that the congregation is invited to interact around, but also, and maybe even more importantly, the process. Christian life is always about relationships, our relationships with one another, with the world around us, and especially with God, who is at work in all of those settings. Many folks, many church leaders and members that I've talked to have found this pandemic time extremely difficult. You hear words like, we're in the midst of a pandemic, we can't go to church. And then someone chimes in, yes, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop being the church. And there's the rub, all the challenges of what it means to be the church. And so you'll see in each one of these activities, these resources, the assumption is that we would have access to each other. We would be talking to each other. Now that becomes extremely complex in the midst of a pandemic Um, and so one of the resources that is included is how do we make adaptations in terms of how we actually logistically implement these processes and activities in the midst of a pandemic. There are answers, and they're creative, and they're meaningful. But perhaps what's hardest of all is to be just totally cut off from one another. There are many stories of churches that are doing very creative things, inspiring things, in finding the ways to literally continue to connect with one another and expand the ways and who's involved in doing ministry, small group, large group, with and to and for one another in the community beyond. All right. Step number one, we title, Tell Me a Story. It's about a heritage event. It's about recognizing that the future that God has in mind for a church is built on the gifts and blessings of God's presence with the church from the past. A church's identity, sense of purpose, and mission are all caught up in its past and in its present. This is not like an anniversary celebration or ain't it awful that we can't just be like we always were. This is literally helping the congregation, the members of a congregation, to begin to tell their stories and to capture some of the richness of what's involved in that story. The value and power is an exercise that creates space for literally every member of the church potentially to engage in telling a story. I'm not talking about long-winded stories. I'm talking about a 2-minute story. Tell me a story about your church that you can capture in about 2 minutes. As the instructions to our resource says, from time to time in the experience of our churches, there are moments that capture meaning and a sense of the heart of a church's identity. These little episodes can characterize your church for us. And then to invite members to reflect for a time and try to identify an experience that captures that for you, and then tell such a story. Now imagine the diversity of your churches. You've got some 90-year-olds. How about some 60-year-olds? 50, 40? What about 12-year-olds? Would we even involve children in such an undertaking? The process, the what and the important is that we're seeking to capture the stories that literally name for us the foundations of what's going on in our church. As each story is told in a small group, just to illustrate, to help you imagine how this works, everyone listens carefully, and they're given 3 things to listen for. In the midst of this story, this little story, what values jump out for you? What seems to be important to us or to this church as it's expressed in this story? Second set of questions, what beliefs about what God is up to here in our church are captured in this story or implied or stated? And then finally, what is the core of our mission or our purpose here in this church? Now imagine you could get 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people telling stories, capturing them in small groups, and the summaries of these comments and questions being pulled together. But you begin to create a pretty comprehensive and compelling and diverse picture, from stories by young adults, teenagers, to some of the most senior members of our congregations. What's ironic is how the power of the Holy Spirit is operative in the midst of this kind of interaction. We're all looking at and thinking about and sharing stories about our church from different perspectives, but we're listening with the same lenses and finding people capturing and describing many of the same values, the same sense of purpose and mission, the same awareness of how God is here. But now it comes alive in rich and fruitful and helpful ways. We're about helping each other learn from one another's experience. I have to share with you this exercise, Tell Me a Story, in the many, many times that we've introduced it to congregations, has almost always been a home run experience. By that I mean not only generating meaningful data, but just literally the experience of being the church together, of having access, being listened to, taken seriously. We haven't seen each other or talked to each other or shared with each other than about the weather or the sports for a long time. Now, obviously, uh, pandemic makes it challenging to us, but not impossible. And so there's a whole series of adaptations that can be helpful. But just so you're not left hanging with that thought, imagine, because of these circumstances, the need to create multiple times, places, and even methodologies that might enable little groups, 4 people, 6 people, maybe 8 is a more at the most. Imagine having a pretty big social hall in your church where at the far end, 8 chairs are set in a big circle, um, with social distance set way out. People walk in, move to that space wearing masks, hand sanitizer, and then sit down and are able to see one another and listen to one another as they share the stories. Imagine a social hall of a church so big you could have another group of 8 at the other end. There can be different times. These things can happen on conference calls with cell phones or any kind of phone, or with technology like Zoom, even Facebook. All right, let me pause. Tell me a story. The importance is to capture this information and to begin to share it all back with the members of our church provides a foundation for us in looking to the future, and even as we begin to think about calling a pastor. The future God has in mind for us builds on the blessings and the gifts and the insights and meaning from the past. Grounded in this helps energize and prepare a church as it continues to move through an interim time. All right, I'm pausing to just glance over here at the chat comment section to see if there's anything else that um, anybody wants to ask. And if I don't get to you right away during our presentation, I'll get back to you later. All right. Of these 5 activities in the interim journey resource, 3 of them are geared toward engaging the entire congregation, broad participation. And 2 of them are intended to be used specifically with leadership teams and key leadership groups. And the fruit of those leadership group sessions obviously gets shared with everyone. But part of what we're asked is literally facilitating the interaction and the learning and the sharing in different settings within your Christian church, within your congregations. And I'll also mention that these resources are not just linear, as if they have to be done in one way. They're the order and even doing more than one at a time can happen. And part of what makes this particular set of resources valuable is that it's scalable. The length of time and how you integrate it into the life and flow of your church is different and needs to be responsive to the moment in time for your church. That's why a coach is helpful to help you design and guide you in using some of these resources. The second resource is called Listening to the Spirit. This is an exercise for the key leadership group. What we're wanting to generate is a rich conversation that invites and supports key leaders in reflecting on the life of your church right now with a wide angle lens, giving you a set of questions that lets everyone begin to look and reflect in a very holistic way. What's going on in our church right now? What do we see and begin to identify as real opportunities and real challenges as we look to the future? The tool that's used in listening to the Spirit, is based on a systems model of the church and mission and ministry. There are literally a series of questions that are answered online. That's the methodology of it. And then a report is generated. All the responses are anonymous. But what's important, this isn't about creating some kind of score as if we're going to rate or evaluate or create percentages in terms of where you rank with other churches. The whole purpose of the process and the tool is to facilitate perhaps one of the richest conversations, openness and sharing, creating the climate for that among your leaders, church leadership, governing council, pastors, and other key leaders. Maybe one of the richest conversations you've ever had. That's been the reaction by many, many of the churches who've worked through this process. What's unique about it is the questions invite reflection on different aspects of church life. But what's more important than how you answered a set of questions is why, what you saw, what you had in mind, what were you thinking? So now, just to illustrate, imagine the leaders coming back together now and blocking out a nice chunk of time, 2 hours or more, where you're sitting in social distance, but in a place where you can see and learn and listen to one another. And as you begin to discuss different questions, imagine you look at one particular area and you begin to share with one another. We've got a report that shows how people answered, that most of us answered pretty much the same, and we all answered in ways that considered this a real strength. Well, now the conversation becomes beginning to share with each other a little bit about um, what did you have in mind when you answered that? How do you see that strength operating in the life of our church? But here, a process that literally expands and enriches how each of you see and understand a particular dynamic of the church. But now imagine just the opposite. We're looking at another area, and as we look at the responses, about half of us answered one way, and the other half answered almost the exact opposite. That half of us saw this in the most positive way, and then the other half in almost the most negative way, based on the way the questions were proposed. Well, now there's lots to discuss. This isn't about arguing, I'm right, you're wrong. This is about listening and learning. Now it's real rich conversation as you begin to share not so much how you answered, but what you had in mind as you answered. Oh, I never thought about it that way. I answered this way. That's a totally new perspective for me. And the conversations continue. For many church governing boards, as I said, this is one of the richest conversations they've had in a long time. And at the end of this activity, having listened and learned from one another, everyone is involved in beginning to identify from the lists of the key areas that we've been discussing and reflecting on. What are emerging for you as 1, 2, or 3 real priority areas that represent real opportunities and or challenges? Most challenges and opportunities are both. But also areas where there's energy that we really believe it'll be important and helpful for us to pick up and respond to in the coming year or years. A valuable perspective that helps your church leadership team grow in its ability to work as a team, to share openly and reflectively together, but also key input about priorities that will guide the interim journey process, the profiling, and the discerning of new pastors. Let me pause and to see if there are some questions. Breakout rooms are wonderful for introverts who struggle with large groups on Zoom. Yes, they are. I'm probably going to catch up. If you're reading all these, I'm way behind, but I'm just going to glance. How does the story get recorded? as individuals are telling a story that's about 2 minutes, everyone listens to it. The stories aren't recorded. Um, but in many cases, this was actually almost a norm when groups were telling a story before a pandemic. Imagine being a room where you've got table groups, maybe 6 or 8 of them, with 6 people at every table, and there's 6 people telling a story, and everyone's capturing the insights. Uh, but at the end of the initial round, each table is encouraged to nominate what's one story that you think was so powerful at your table that it would be just really helpful for everybody to hear. And then those stories begin to be told as different folks stand up, and the whole group again listens for the core characteristics. Um, all of the compiled responses to the stories are collated and put together later. But then many churches find that since not everyone in our congregation was able to be part of this, how might we share some of these stories or ask some of those who told them to share them on a Sunday morning? Um, so, Eric, that is one way. Uh, there are some churches that have recorded and played stories for their churches, but there's an intimidation factor to that for a lot of people. I like Amy's response here too. I really appreciate the fact that Jennifer Amy Dressler is with us. And she is an interim pastor, or has been in numerous cases, and she's been trained in this resource. And so I think it's quite familiar. So you may be able to answer these way before I get to them, Jennifer. Thank you for that. All right, let me see where I'm at. I don't want to. Let me move to the third of the key practices. This is suggested for the entire congregation. I don't know if you've done that before, where you would take scripture and begin to reflect on it together as an entire congregation, so that it's not just the Bible study groupies that like to do Bible study, but literally the entire congregation taking our current understanding and experience of our mission and practice, and using a biblical lens, a gospel perspective, to begin to reflect anew on Jesus's words, how he is calling us, um, and in light of that, to begin in small groups to share and reflect on what are some implications from what we're hearing and reading and thinking for the life of our church at this time. The particular resource that we recommend for this is titled People of Salt and Light, and it's based on the Sermon on the Mount. Um, Everyone in the church gets a copy. Um, it has 4 key sections, and at the end of each conversation section, there's an integrating question that invites the small group. The assumption is we'll be in small groups again, 4, 6, 8, depending on a setting. But at the end of it, beginning to look at the fruit and the result and the serendipity of the Holy Spirit across the groups that met at different times, as we begin to capture the ahas, the insights. In light of this, what are some of the implications for you that you see as you reflect on Jesus's words and how we might be called to participate in the world that God so loves in an even fuller way, or that we might embrace Jesus's model of right relationship in an even fuller way as we look to the future. This is Bible study, and there's a rich facilitation support. We're talking about a methodology where this is not a lecture, not a teaching, but literally a facilitating, a sharing of faith and reflections that is intentionally designed and written in a way that makes it doable and not threatening, but very engaging for members of a church. The what and the why. And once again, the insights that are captured that contribute to our emerging reflection on what is yet to come. Comments about biblical reflections? So the fourth event is called an envisioning event. Now imagine that if our congregation broadly is participating in these events, from telling me a story, uh, from scripture, engaging in scripture reflections, maybe receiving some input from our leaders related to some of the emerging sense of priorities, opportunities, and challenges facing us. The entire congregation is invited to come together for a visioning event that typically would be woven into a Sunday, but logistics will need to be addressed depending on when in the year. I mean, if you're doing this in May, you may be able to do something outside that is quite safe for one another. But um, this is about now um, inviting people to pull on and building on the reflections that we've already done. Um, how do we begin to name our hopes, begin to look with faithful imaginations to the future that God is calling us to be, seeing with the eyes of faith? We're not asking people to come up with program ideas or to build a strategic plan here, what we're going to do or what we think will fix, how do we get more members. We're looking to identify key elements that help us begin to articulate our emerging sense of what God may be calling us to. It will also become part of the guide for how we choose a pastor. Just to give you an example of some of the core questions after the table is set and people are in their groups and have been invited to reflect a little bit on what's happened previously. Question number one, the world we live in now, what's the kind of church that the world we live in now really needs? The world we live in now really needs a church that ... What would you fill out? What kind of church does our world really need right now? Second question. I'm inspired deeply already by the way our church does ... What can we name and claim about what our church is currently doing that's inspiring? And finally, I would be honored to be a part of a congregation that ... I wanted to just give you enough so that you can imagine an exercise that's set up well with all the details and invitation. It includes usually worship and even some food if we can make it happen. But those are the logistics of designing and operating. I'm going to describe to you the fifth activity, and then I'm going to look for your questions and comments to see if there are some things you want to ask and answer. I'll also share to you, some may have joined later, but I had mentioned early on, for anyone who would like it, and if I know who you are and have your email address, I would be happy to send you a copy of the introduction and overview to this resource that has it spelled out in about 7 pages in a very helpful way that'll let you have something in your hands that you can reflect on. And then obviously, if conversation is helpful in the coming weeks, we're available. The fifth activity is for the leadership. Having engaged in all these different aspects of the interim journey, then the core leadership comes together to begin to gather insights. What are we learning? And literally, they will begin to review the input and the activity that we've recorded from all the other steps along the way. The story and the core values and the sense of purpose that has emerged from our past that we will build on. The insights from scripture study. The detailed thinking and wrestling with the interim journey, beginning to identify with systems perspective the real areas of opportunity and challenge that we see that will be a part of our future. The visioning event, where we literally welcomed and invited our congregation to share their dreams and hopes about the future for our church. Based on what went before. So we're not looking for pipe dreams, but literally what comes out of our hearts and minds based on our experience here. All of that in a very carefully helpfully outlined process design for key leaders will facilitate conversation and allowing them to summarize and literally contribute to the missional profile that will be used by the call committee as you start to search for and interview different pastoral candidates. Um, Let me stop. Obviously, there's so much more detail, and it's not realistic given our format. I think we're already about 40 minutes in. I'm going to look to see if there's some questions just dying to be asked. And maybe this is enough for now. It's not as if we have to respond to everything in one detailed webinar. I'm certainly open to providing future webinars that could literally train and introduce leaders in using these kinds of resources. So at this point, let me thank you for being a part of the group. Let me thank you for your comments and questions, and I will continue. I'll spend some time with them because I've only glanced at them during the actual presentation. I hope the flow of this has been helpful. I'm welcome. I would welcome your feedback too. This is the second in my efforts of learning how to do a Facebook Live adventure, and I'm hoping to learn how to do it in a way that's very helpful for those of you who come to join us, and that can make a difference in the churches that you lead and that you support. Thank you all. And at this time, I ask God to bless you and our country as we get ready to welcome in new leadership. I know there's groups of us who will be praying for peace as we move into a day of inauguration. And may God bless you all. Thank you.